Welcome to NoCap Game Development. Today, I'll be playing Halo 1, the CE anniversary. I am using the keyboard and mouse because that is easiest for me to record. I will be using the classic visuals and the remastered audio. I prefer the old school graphics, and hopefully seeing the game that the original developers saw will help us get into their heads a little bit. Additionally, I'll play on normal difficulty with no skulls. The goal of this series is to study the game design principles by actively pointing out, explaining, and making sense of what I see in what I consider masterpiece games. The first masterpiece game that I will be test running this personal project series on is Halo: Combat Evolved. As the focus of this series is to study the game design principles, this is not a let's play, this is not a follow along or a tutorial of how to beat Halo. Think of this more like field research. I'm going into the game, taking measurements, asking questions, exploring the game space. Therefore, the focus will not be on the cutscenes, the story, how fun this game is, not a review, and I don't have any gaming skills to show off. The focus will be on what makes this game good. What were the developers thinking about when they made this, and what lessons can we as designers learn from this game? And now, with all of that out of the way, let's play some video games. I know I said that I wouldn't focus on the cutscenes, but I do want to talk about some of them. One goal of this opening cutscene was to show off all the cool hardware on the Pillar of Autumn. They got tanks, they got Pelican dropships, these Warthog vehicles. You don't see this concentration of human hardware anywhere else in the game. But it's a little wasted as an intro. A brand new player doesn't know how powerful one of these Scorpion tanks is. They're fun. But if you're brand new, the sense of scale of this cutscene is a little lost. Okay, on to the tutorial proper. The most important thing, the very first thing the developers teach to a new player is how to look around. Ultimately, Halo is a game about looking at things. Eventually we'll get a gun, but before we do, we have to master the ability of controlling the camera. A little bit of context about this game. This was one of the first games on the original Xbox. The developers knew many of their players have never played a video game, never even held a controller before. It was very important that they got this tutorial right. So how do the devs teach a noob how to play a first-person shooter video game like Halo? Well, they introduce all of the affordances one at a time. First they lock you in place and they teach you how to look around. Then they unlock you and allow you to move around. And all of this happens in a small, simple, quiet room.
I know the ordnance techs usually take care of your targeting sensors, but we're short of time, Chief. Just look at each of the flashing panels to target them. When you lock on, it'll change color. Okay, that looks good.
Sir, I'm getting some calibration errors. I'm going to invert your looking pitch, so you can see if you like it better that way. Try targeting the flashing lights again.
Those of you who have played a Halo game before may remember this part. The game is helping the player set up personal preferences and configurations. Specifically here is the vertical looking pitch. There's much to be said about that configuration specifically, but generally it is good design to set up stations like this, which allow the player to change these configurations while the game is hot, while the game is running. Too often are settings like this hidden away deep in a menu somewhere, which makes it difficult for a player to judge which settings are important and best for them. Good for Halo. I wish more games did stuff like this. Now, this next station, in my opinion, could have been done a little bit better. The topic of this tutorial segment here is the player's shield. Notice it in the top right corner. What they're going to do is they're going to bring it down to 0.
All right. Shields read as fully charged.
And demonstrate that, look, it will, after a few moments, your shields will recharge, and so find cover in that time. This is not an effective way to teach this skill. These yellow particle effects aren't used anywhere else in the game, and a more natural tutorial would be a live fire exercise. Shoot the player with a real gun. Make them take realistic damage. Prepare them for the real game. Now, while this shield diagnostics might be flavorful and provide a little world building about human technology, it gets in the way of effective teaching. Here's another section of this level, another lesson focusing on shields. In the distance, you can see a bad guy standing behind this energy shield, and a naive player will just start shooting. But they will quickly realize that nothing is really happening. This is an emergent tutorial, a tutorial that a player may discover on their own, but more importantly, it is also an active tutorial compared to that first shield tutorial, which was a very passive tutorial. In active tutorial, the devs set up a situation where the player attempts or is incentivized to do something, and in the act of doing the thing, the player will experience the results and quickly learn the lessons intended. In this example, the player attempts to shoot the alien. The effect is the alien is unharmed, so lesson learned, this thing in front of us is a big shield. So now, compare the 30 seconds of this gameplay versus the 30 seconds of this gameplay. Which shield tutorial was more compelling for a new player? Which 30 seconds was more fun? Which tutorial was more effective?
I'll leave the self-diagnostics running at least.
Back in the hushed casket room, one challenge all video games face is how to push the player out of the nest. The player, by definition, needs agency. The tutorial teacher can't guide them through everything. How do you naturally make it so the player is on their own? Killing off the tutorial teacher is a common trope. If you're looking to add a little emotional texture to your game, consider killing off these first Guardian NPCs that the player has interacted with. But now we're on our own, we don't exactly know where we need to go. We could go back, or we can follow this giant green arrow on the ground. And this introduces the concept of signposts. Notice that these red doors do not open, but the green doors do. The color green here is a signpost which signals where the player should be going. Now, this bright neon green signal won't work very well in settings like nature because it won't stand out as much, but it really pops in dark indoor technical areas like the Pillar of Autumn here. Speaking of dark indoors, we are about to get our first close-up of the enemy. Why have the close-up in a poorly lit room? Because the focus isn't on the alien, it's on the alien's shield. The devs clearly believed this blue particle effect was more important for a player to see than the alien itself, so they set up a dark room that made it very easy to see the particle effect and hard to see the alien. But why? Is this a good design choice? Turns out these energy shields have gameplay impact. I'll talk about the elites in a later episode, but here, the devs want the player to know that the elites are special, and they have a special shield, just like the player. Here's another kind of close-up, a live fire demo. Notice that generally they're ignoring the player, or at least their aim is really poor. They'll get much more accurate soon, let me tell you. The tone may have shifted, but this is still very much part of the tutorial. The focus is still about teaching the player how to look and how to move, getting the player more comfortable with the controller. Now, it's much more exciting, but the training wheels are still there. The devs are tricking the player into thinking they're having fun, when actually the player is still just learning. Good design.
Captain Keyes is waiting for us, sir.
The opening cutscene took place in this room. Older games put an emphasis on reusing assets. Any kind of cutscene or texture or element that an artist built would show up multiple times, partly because of technological limitations. But also, it's good design to let the player explore that content themselves. It's a game. The important part is allowing the player to interact with the content you built for them. Now we're armed, but that doesn't mean the tutorial has ended. This small room is the first shooting tutorial. Important here that these three grunts are pretty bad at their job. gives the player a little more safe space to figure out and practice how shooting works. Learn to shoot. Immediately next, there are more enemies. We can see them over there. But in order to get there, we have to walk over this guy. As we walk over him, the player gets a new toy to play with. It's a great way to introduce so many different mechanics of this game. Walking over stuff to pick up ammo, looking at dead bodies allows you to pick up different guns. That single choke point demonstrates so many powerful and important mechanics of this game. It's clear the developers believe in tutorial by doing instead of by saying. They force the player to do something, and in the act of doing that thing, the player more effectively learns how to play. The reason that lesson even worked in the first place is because of the architecture of the level. Notice we are indoors, everything is small, closed, confined corridors. I have no choice but to follow into this area. If the level was more open, the player might miss an important trigger, like that dead Marine. Also, it makes sense for the design of this first level to be straight, narrow, linear. There's only one path for the player really to follow. It's challenging for a player to get lost in a straight path. But what happens if a player does get lost? This room is a big circle, and a player might get turned around during combat and decide, this is the way that I need to go. Turns out this is backwards, but let's explore a little. The door is locked. This blocks the player from backtracking. This is another great side effect of having small hallways in a tutorial level. It's a lot easier to corral the player towards where they need to go. Those of you who have played Halo 1 before may remember it opens up quite a bit in the later levels, and it's very easy to get lost in this game. I'll talk about that when actually playing these later levels, but for now, level 1, it's pretty hard to get lost. However, this architectural style comes with a drawback. In a small linear hallway, it can get boring, very samey. It's important to have diversity in atmosphere and level texture. For example, one section is very dark, while this other part is more well lit. This room has different wall textures. Everything looks burnt out compared to these other rooms that are much more clean. This keeps the player engaged, always exploring, experiencing new things. Now, earlier when I said straight hallway, I didn't mean literally straight. There are lots of curves and turns and doorways, which also keeps things interesting, both in a combat sense and as level texture. Additionally, each play space has interesting stuff in it. There's barricades, good guys, bad guys, explosions. As far as the eye can see, there's stuff going on. Now, earlier I said it's important to reuse assets and textures, but this can quickly be overdone and become a major flaw. If the next section of a dungeon looks exactly like the current section, then the player will get bored and won't be drawn forward into the game. Developing compelling level texture is more of an art than a science, but I think the Halo 1 devs executed it masterfully. Another benefit of having narrow architecture for a first level: a player doesn't have to be good at aiming to be effective here. Now, if things are more open, then a player's aim will become more important. But because things are so narrow, the level itself funnels enemies into an easy-to-aim-at section on the screen. Also, notice here, everything is very flat. I don't have to worry about looking up or down, just left or right. By flattening the play space, the devs are making it easier for a new player. In fact, you could probably have some moderate success in this first level while only using movement controls and disabling your look controls. Now, I wouldn't recommend it, but it's clear the devs have thought about it. As I touched on earlier, narrow levels create choke points that the developers can use. Here, the developers are using it to load up the player with more ammo. It's impossible to progress without picking up ammo scattered all over this level. In fact, the developers have saturated these halls with ammo and guns, making it almost impossible for the player to run out. It's clear the only thing the devs want the player to focus on is mastering the ability to move, the ability to look, and the ability to shoot. They don't have to worry about ammo, they don't need to worry about cover, they don't even need to worry about health management. the enemy targeting AI is still pretty poor. Remember earlier I was saying the level was flat, which was a good design decision? Well, now, to quote Cortana, there are...
Covenant, on the landing above us.
I'm about 22 minutes into this first level, and the training wheels are slowly starting to come off. But there's still much to learn. Here's another example of the safe space tutorial zone. We saw it in the first cutscene of the game with the hushed casket. We saw it with the first gun we had with those 3 grunts. And now here with our first smash action. The target is a door. It can't shoot back. Immediately around the corner, the devs have placed the familiar sacrificial grunt. Notice they don't prompt you to melee this grunt like they did with the door. There's no sassy remark from Cortana saying that a back attack will instantly kill an enemy. The player just has to figure that mechanic out on their own. Halo is a game about shooting aliens, not sneaking around and quietly hitting aliens in the back. The devs must have had a real challenge trying to teach the player this mechanic without changing the tone of the game too much. They clearly didn't want to stray from their core gameplay of shooting aliens is fun. So the very next room is a bunch of aliens that are impossible to sneak up on, forcing the player back into the shooting aliens mindset. This is another example of an emergent tutorial. The first time the player is exposed to grenades is in a big rack like this, and just within throwing distance is a nice cluster of aliens. They're still not very good at shooting the player, which gives me a moment to collect my thoughts and very calmly push the grenade button. And the devs have given us more than enough grenades to adjust our aim and practice a little more. Very fun.
Chief?
And so
Chief, can you
starts
hear me?
level 2, the first non-tutorial level
Are you
of this
alright?
game.
Can you
All
move?
your companions are dead, and the player is alone on a beautiful ring world. It's no coincidence that the first scene after emerging from the transport pod is looking directly at this ring.
The impact.
This opening scene of level 2 gives the player a few moments to collect their thoughts, make sure they remember how to move, look, and shoot. But now they're lost.
Warning.
This
I detected
humongous
multiple
area
Covenant
is
dropships
so
on approach.
strikingly different from
I
the
recommend moving
closed,
into those
confined
hills.
hallways of the Pillar of
However,
Autumn, the
the Covenant
tutorial
believe
level.
that everyone
It's
aboard this lifeboat
almost
died in the
overwhelming. It's hard to determine where to go. There are no signposts, no green neon lights, no enemies. The intention of this scene, probably one of the most powerful scenes of any video game, is you are in space now. You are on Halo. You are completely alone on an alien world. This scene stands out as one of my most memorable. I can confidently say it's one of the best designed, composed, and choreographed scenes of any video game. But that's as far as I'll go for this video. To summarize, Halo Combat Evolved starts with a 30-minute long tutorial level, where the narrow and linear level architecture allows the developers to stuff it full with teaching moments. Additionally, the overall danger to the player was fairly low. In the next episode, I'll take a look at level 2, landing on Halo. There, I'll consider the design of some of the enemies themselves, along with whatever else the Halo developers have in store for us.